Call me Roy Orbison, because this Bayou leaves me blue. Black and blue, actually. It's The Adventures of Bayou Billy on NES Works.
About there. In the bayou, half a mile from the plantation.
There's something kind of pathetic about The Adventures of Bayou Billy, a game that desperately wants you to love it and think it's awesome. It is not, unfortunately, awesome. It is, however, very interesting. It isn't necessarily interesting for the right reasons, admittedly, but Konami tried to do a lot of things here that make this one of the most cutting-edge releases for NES in 1989. But that's where Bayou Billy falls flat, honestly. It wants to be everything to everyone. It wants to do everything, to outdo everyone else. Bayou Billy is not the first game we've seen of this nature on NES. Frankly, as multimodal action games go, it's not a patch on Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode. It is far more polished than that game, of course, because Vic Tokai and its white label subcontractors were not, to be blunt about it, Konami. But honestly, who was? We're talking about top talent and top form here. When it came to NES, especially here in the early days of the console's peak era, it was all about Konami and Capcom. That meme about confusing the two exists for a reason. I don't think those two companies saw themselves as competitors on NES, but when it came to third-party publishers, they more or less ran the show for years. And it's perhaps fitting that just as Capcom publishes a game that raises the bar technically and artistically for NES, I'm talking about Mega Man 2 here, Konami retorts with their own boundary-pushing creation in Bayou Billy. In fact, I might even give Bayou Billy the technical edge over Mega Man 2. This is, speaking in strictly technical, not artistic terms, quite likely the single most impressive thing we've seen on NES to date. For starters, The Adventures of Bayou Billy spans three wildly different genres, meaning it somehow crams graphics and programming code for those three very distinct modes into its memory. This game shows Konami once again dominating the NES hardware, just as they did with Track and Field 2 a few months earlier, pulling off feats that other developers either couldn't achieve or simply didn't conceive of attempting. Bayou Billy wants to dazzle you from the moment you switch on the machine. The title screen ripples into place by way of a flashy raster effect that I don't recall having seen yet on NES, a neat little touch of showmanship to get things moving. The tricks don't let up there. In addition to jumbo light gun mode sprites and high-speed road race visuals, Bayou Billy also includes impressive but subtle effects like convincingly transparent shadows beneath characters' feet. Again, details you just didn't see on NES at this point. Sonically, Bayou Billy grabs your attention from the start too. The moment you launch into the game, a sampled voice calls out its title.
The Adventures of Bayou Billy!
A trick that would become a trademark of 32-bit era releases like Street Fighter II and Resident Evil from Capcom. Yeah, those guys again. Bayou Billy's opening demo music loop, while short and repetitive, gives off a sort of club techno vibe complete with wailing sirens, a full 2 years before Yuzo Koshiro would bring that same spirit to Streets of Rage to enormous acclaim. The music also contains another early example of live instrument sampling on NES, similar to the drums in Tecmo's '89 games. The game's composer remains proud of this gimmick, and rightly so. When I wrote the liner notes for the Ship to Shore Phono vinyl EP release of Bayou Billy, the one corrective note I received back from Konami was a remark by the original composer asking me to highlight the strum effect. It's a well-deserved shout-out. The music here sounds great. Even the gameplay manages to incorporate a lot of varied elements that clearly required some development effort. Billy can pick up a variety of alternate weapons to supplement his basic fisticuffs, including a stick, a throwing knife, and even a Castlevania-style whip that uses the same sizzling sound as Simon Belmont's Vampire Killer. Billy can also collect body armor to reduce combat injuries, and even the occasional handgun. Pressing select allows you to toggle between melee weapons and your gun. We're still in the early days for the walk and punch brawler here. Its final fight was half a year away, and even Technos hadn't yet fully committed, turning Renegade into a sports series. So Bayou Billy offers a lot of variety in terms of weapons. And then you make it through the brawling sequences and enter an Operation Wolf-style light gun mode that's about 5 times as fun and a heck of a lot more impressive looking than the NES version of Operation Wolf. The scenario rolls right into a driving mode in which you need to Mach Rider your way across the American South, gunning down enemy cars and hucking dynamite at low-flying choppers. In a lot of ways, Bayou Billy feels way ahead of its time, not only in terms of its cutting-edge technical design, but also in terms of its ambition. Again, Golgo 13 Top Secret Mission had presented an early form of mode-shifting game design a year before Bayou Billy arrived, cramming multiple play formats into a single cartridge. Developer Cebu Lys took that messy, ambitious approach in order to capture the spirit of the underlying property and gave the game its licensed lead character and art, the Golgo 13 manga. Bayou Billy goes the multimodal route for the same reason. It wants to mimic the beats of a Hollywood movie. Not any particular film, mind you. This is another of Konami's clearly inspired by, but not actually paying a license fee to adapt a hit movie projects, a la Rush and Attack, Castlevania, Contra, and so on. Video games have had movie envy for as long as they've been able to express jealous vibes. Film is the older, cooler sibling to gaming. The dominant thread of game design and presentation for decades has amounted to a movie you can play. This has resulted in a lot of design choices that undermine the fundamental appeal of interactive media. Consider Dragon's Lair, which tapped one of the era's greatest animators to create a beautiful mini-movie anchored to a game that consisted of making blind guesses as you attempted to perform control prompts at crucial moments, and whose shoddy design somehow survived well into the 1990s and the Silhouette boom. For consoles without the memory capacity to store 30 minutes of Don Bluth animation, developers tended to go the Golgo 13 Bayou Billy route, jamming together multiple forms of gameplay. The style of play dates back to early arcade games like Donkey Kong, which varied the level layouts Mario had to conquer in order to keep things interesting, and led to Williams' Tron, a game based on a movie based on video games. The multi-format style of play in pursuit of the Hollywood experience would become standard fare on NES and other consoles of the era, but it wouldn't really come into its own until the late 1990s, as the move to 3D graphics made the transition between playstyles more seamless. Look at the visual inconsistency between Bayou Billy's brawling, shooting, and driving scenes. Aside from the unified Konami aesthetic, these could easily be 3 different games. It wouldn't be until the likes of Tribes and Halo Combat Evolved allowed players to move gracefully between modes of play without breaking camera connections or control configurations that video games would really start to realize their cinematic ambitions. Bayou Billy, alas, arrived about a decade too soon to enjoy the benefits of those technology. And frankly, it didn't deserve a second chance. Once you look beyond the impressive visuals and slick music, The Adventures of Bayou Billy embodies the folly of this slapdash approach to game design. Every section of the game feels like a second-string attempt at its respective genre. Yes, Billy can wield a lot of different weapons as he brawls on foot, but they don't make up for the fundamental lack of depth to be found in his brawling options. The game actually has the audacity to open by pitting the protagonist against a pair of thugs wearing open vests, one clad in red and one in blue, an obvious shots-fired salvo against the Lee brothers of Double Dragon. And Bayou Billy does begin the game with more combat moves than his Lee namesake in the NES port of Double Dragon. You can punch, kick, and jump kick right from the outset. But Billy Lee quickly learns to jump kick in that game, and then to perform a bunch of other moves, including combo uppercuts and elbow smashes. In other versions of Double Dragon, he comes equipped with those talents right from the outset. But this Billy West, evidently performing odd jobs here before making it big as a voice actor, never learns those new tricks. He has to wade through the game using the same single punch, single kick, single jump kick, and whatever weapons he can grab from enemies. Bayou Billy lacks any combo techniques, meaning that when you land a punch on a foe, you never have the chance to trap them in a satisfying stun lock and pound their face into submission. You and the bad guys both trade single strikes back and forth, which makes for a boring and unsatisfying form of play. Billy lacks dirty tricks like attacking foes while they're down. He has no submission holds, and he's slow to change his facing. It's actually the worst hand-to-hand combat we've seen to date in an NES Melee combat game, and I'm including Muscle WWF and Kung Fu Heroes here. The shooting is at least a little better, maintaining a fast pace, but not expecting rapid fire the way Operation Wolf did. And the game does allow you to play with either a zapper or a D-pad, depending on your preference or budget. Unfortunately, this leads into the driving scenes, which feel like they want to be Spy Hunter, but actually play more like a step backward from Mach Rider. Narrow roads and hairpin turns and aggressive enemies make these scenes more annoying than fun, though that presumes you can even make your way through the crummy brawling that demands you find an exploit and cheese your way to success as early as the first stage. I suppose it goes without saying that there is no two-player option here, right? The big, though stiffly animated characters in brawling mode are so large that Billy can't even crack his whip without triggering a sprite flicker routine in order to work within the hardware's display limitations. There's no way they could have squeezed two players into this framework at once. Not that Bayou Billy's unofficial source material offered much opportunity for two-player action. Konami drew on a variety of different film sources here to shape the game's style and setting, which, being based in America's Deep South and culminating in a New Orleans showdown, does at least have the benefit of being pretty novel among action games of the era. But all of those movie nods tilt toward films about a single hero dispensing vigilante justice. You've got the one-man army frontal assault on a militarized private compound a la Commando. But this being the American South, not South America, a lot of the set pieces here, especially the parts where you have to leap past and punch alligators, seem to pull heavily from Live and Let Die, where James Bond went to New Orleans to undermine the schemes of a thinly veiled effigy of Francois Papadoc Duvalier with the help of a voodoo fortune teller and a lot of imagery and storytelling that do not hold up well 50 years later. There also appears to be a lot of Dukes of Hazzard here, from the corpulent crime boss with the goofball lieutenants to the fact that Billy's love interest wears what the kids these days call Daisy Dukes. And even the mangrove swamps call to mind the likes of Deliverance. Of course, the hero himself looks so much like the lead character in Crocodile Dundee that Paul Hogan deserves a fee for likeness rights. But Crocodile Dundee is the wrong kind of South, not American, but rather Australian, aka the British South. Basically what I'm saying is that The Adventures of Bayou Billy resulted from a lot of imported media influences being absorbed by a Japanese development team and processed into something that seems almost surgically crafted to become a hit in the US. And, as a matter of fact, the US version of Bayou Billy is another way in which the game stood at the cutting edge of the medium. It represents a new way of thinking about how to sell video games in America, where video game shops had begun to allow NES game rentals. This represented a sort of existential threat to video game publishers. At the time, rental shops primarily existed as an outlet for movies on VHS and Laserdisc, and the home video industry existed in a sort of symbiosis with these shops. Videotapes in the 1980s cost many times what a DVD or Blu-ray does today, sometimes as much as $80 or $90, and that's not adjusted for inflation. VHS tapes of Hollywood releases were premium goods at the time, and while that pricing structure had begun to give way by the end of the 80s, the reality was that rental shops were the only way most people could afford to watch movies at home, outside of the ABC Movie of the Week or whatever. Video shops quickly realized they could take the same approach to NES games as with videotapes. Now, game rentals had existed before the NES, but the explosive popularity of Nintendo's console and the demographic shift of the platform toward younger consumers meant that video game rentals offered the same budget-friendly proposition for NES-loving kids that VHS rentals did for their parents. Why drop $39.99 on buying a game when you could spend $2.99 and rent it for a weekend? This was a great value for kids who no longer had to risk wasting an ungodly sum of allowance, or worse, sacrifice a precious birthday gift selection on a game that they'd end up hating. And it had a lot of appeal for rental shops too. Not only did it help expand their audience to a younger demographic, NES games only cost about half of what VHS tapes did, so those shops could make back their investment more quickly. However, this posed a dire threat for publishers, who saw the danger to their potential sales. Sure, kids traded and lent games to their friends all the time, and it's not like everyone who played The Legend of Zelda bought The Legend of Zelda. But suddenly, a single copy of a game could be sold and then lent to dozens upon dozens of kids, few of whom were going to spend a weekend with a game for $3 and then rush out to buy their own copy at full price. If a kid could rent a game for a few days for the price of a couple of comic books, complete the whole thing in a weekend, and return it, why would they ever want to think about it again? Unless the game was really damn good, or just entirely too vast to complete in a single weekend. That might have been good news for the likes of Ultima Exodus, but it sucked for purveyors of games like Bayou Billy. In its original Japanese incarnation, Mad City, Bayou Billy presented players with a reasonable challenge level. Even gentle. But Konami, recognizing the fact that kids were going to rent this game in America, then chew it up, spit it out, and never think about it again, they retuned Mad City when it became Bayou Billy. Determined that no one should possibly be able to complete this game on a single rental, Konami cranked up the difficulty level to make Bayou Billy literally 4 times as hard as it was on Famicom. That's not an exaggeration. If anything, it understates the situation. The bad guys in Bayou Billy hit twice as hard as they did in Mad City, and they can absorb twice as much damage when attacked by Billy. And 2 times 2 is just the easy math. There's also the fact that the bad guys move more quickly in the US and European releases, and that their attacks have greater priority. In shooting mode, you have fewer bullets and enemies deliver more damage. And the driving mode gives you less time in which to complete each sequence, provides narrower roads on which to navigate, and delivers one-hit kills to your crappy explosive Jeep, which had a health meter on Famicom. Bayou Billy is a hard game, infamously hard. And I guess the scheme must have worked, because the adventures of Bayou Billy seemed to sell pretty well, and many publishers would follow Konami's lead and crank the difficulty level of their NES conversions way up from what had been seen on Famicom. You can pinpoint this sea change in localization philosophy to June 1989. Bayou Billy arrived at the same time as Mega Man 2, a game whose creators presented the original Famicom difficulty level as hard, and added a new easy mode in which Mega Man delivered twice as much damage with his attacks and had a much easier time collecting beneficial power-ups. The Mega Man 2 approach spoke to a somewhat paternalistic mindset by Japanese developers that only Japanese players had the determination to hyper-focus and finish profoundly difficult games, and that Americans and Europeans needed coddling. And that's not necessarily wrong, and I'm glad that this is the reason that we got the fun, interesting Super Mario Bros. 2 instead of the Super Mario Bros. 2 designed to troll Super Mario fans. I don't think that jaundiced view of overseas game consumers ever changed exactly, but ultimately, pragmatism won the day. Japanese publishers eventually came to the realization that there was more to be lost by giving players cuddly, accessible games that they could blast through in a weekend rental than there was to be lost by rebalancing things to be wildly punishing. And so, the adventures of Bayou Billy led the charge of Japanese games retuned to become brutally difficult in America. They sure showed you budget-conscious children with only a few dollars of spending cash to your name. It's worth noting that more changed than just the difficulty tuning when Mad City became The Adventures of Bayou Billy. Konami reworked a lot of the game, from the music to the graphics. The brawler levels in Bayou Billy are longer, not just more difficult, and they look different. The US version also drops the multiple endings of the Famicom release. It's worth noting here that the US release of The Adventures of Bayou Billy was heavily delayed. It shipped nearly a year after the date that Konami originally provided for it in their Fun Club news advertisement. All of the games in that promo ended up slipping from their announced launch dates, almost certainly as a result of the infamous 1988 chip shortage. But Bayou Billy suffered a much more significant delay than its sibling titles, which suggests that the slippage resulted from more than mere manufacturing yields. I mean, Castlevania 2 required a full J2E localization, which was no small feat in those days. You get the sense that Konami hit pause on this one and really thought about how they should give it a massive tactical overhaul. Which is a shame, really. The Japanese version is a lot more fun. But I guess, screw you if you want a game that isn't built to be the home equivalent of a quarter muncher. You'll pay full price for this game and you'll like it, young man. Given its heavy refocusing for the American market, Konami and Nintendo put a lot of promotion into this one. In addition to the tiny obligatory preview blurbs that it got, The Adventures of Bayou Billy also saw a 6-page preview spread in the March-April 1989 issue of Nintendo Power. This was followed the very next issue by another 6-page spread that more or less reprised the same material from the original feature. Kind of an odd choice given all the great stuff they could have promoted in May and June of 1989, but maybe Crime Boss Gordon wasn't the only one on the take here. Next time on NES Works, the NES may have suffered a ROM shortage, but unfortunately, there's no lack of ROMals.